Got it started? Oh, okay. All right, everybody, let's come back together here. We are going to end the book of Nehemiah with a fireworks display. You know, me and my keen interest in how some of the books of the Bible end. Remember that fateful midterm essay question that I asked about book endings and how they kind of give us clues oftentimes in terms of the theology or the theological emphasis that the author is trying to leave behind. So we're going to have a similar kind of thing happen with regards to the endings of Ezra and Nehemiah as it focuses on, well, we'll get to that. I'm just trying to grab your attention because you know me and book endings and, exam questions. I'm just saying. But before we get there, let's turn to Nehemiah chapter 13. And we won't cover all of this, but it really reminds us, it's interesting how the book of Nehemiah is ending. And Nehemiah is giving us a reminder that, the work of spiritual leadership is never over. It's interesting. There's it ends on kind of a Debbie Downer. And this whole chapter, verses 1 through 31, is really focusing on a covenant community, a spiritual community with a bunch of cycles of high, but then here we have some low points. And while Nehemiah is traveling back and forth between Jerusalem and various locations in Persia while serving as governor, of course, he's got that political role, some of these issues that he has to deal with, he's hearing about. So here's what we've got. In verses 4 through 9, there's apparently back home in Jerusalem mismanagement with regards to the living spaces that are made available in the temple for some of those who serve. And then we have verses 10 through 14. We have a mismanagement of tithes and some of the payments that are supposed to be directed to those who are serving in the temple. And then we have in verses 15 down through 22, focusing here certain laws and rules concerning how the Sabbath day is to be conducted and practiced. So now we've got all of these covenant violations going on. And finally, verses 23 through 31, is it possible that this covenant community is reneged on her commitment to not go through with mixed marriages? But there we have it, verse 23. Let's start reading there. Let's see. Oladinde, could you read? Is he here? Oh, he's not. How about you, Cosmos? Could you read for us in verses 23, starting there, and tell you to stop?
In those days, I also saw Jews, married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves."
Have you ever pulled the hair out of some of the members of your church like this? Or should I ask, have you ever felt like doing this? Yeah, that's probably more reasonable. This is an extreme response here, but you see the passion to do it right. Nehemiah's leadership pushes him to the extreme here, I would say, in pulling the hair out. But notice in verse 26, he asks him the theologically loaded question, don't we have a history of this to remind ourselves? Are we supposed to be revisiting this kind of thing? Did Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But the foreign women caused him to sin. That was his problem. Yeah, he received the gift of wisdom. Yeah, he was a great political king, but he made a lot of mistakes in this area. Now, somebody's phone's going off. Is that me? Driving me crazy. All right, sorry about that. That was me. So it sounds, this whole last chapter here in the book of Nehemiah kind of reminds us that, the life of a spiritual leader, pastor, guess what? It never ends. There's always problems that come in, and we're always fighting that battle. I think, unfortunately, the battle of decay creeps in to our own personal covenant communities. We have to be, spiritual leadership requires us to, be aware of those slow decays and also have a plan B. How are we going to respond? How are we going to lead our congregations away from, or individuals in our congregations away from, these pitfalls? So that's interesting. Now, let's get to the last part. This is what I want to say last with regards to how the book of Nehemiah ends. Because if you look at the end of the book of Nehemiah, let's turn back to remind ourselves, how does the book of Ezra end? Remember?
One of the books ends on a real good note, because I remember reading the Ezra and Nehemiah, and I'm thinking, trying to remember now. But it's a happy, it's a celebration at the end.
Not Ezra or Nehemiah. No, not one of these two. Well, I'm sorry about all these Debbie Downer endings for some of these books, but Ezra and Nehemiah, interestingly, both end with a focus on what? Yeah, the mixed marriage problem, which always is leading into syncretistic potential. These mixed marriages and these foreign women bring in, like Solomon, what it did for King Solomon is this tendency to have, decay go on. So what's, this success-failure thing that I have, I'm just going to throw out something that I think is really interesting to think about. And if we look at, again, the endings of these books. So again, the endings that I'm referring to here for Ezra and Nehemiah is the focus on, we seem to have some failure going on. So just log that, failure at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'm building kind of a logical progression here. That I think is kind of interesting. And we've talked, we've also talked about, so let me just start mapping this out. So we've got Ezra, Nehemiah, both focus on failure. And do you remember, maybe this is what you're thinking of, is the ending of the book of Chronicles. You remember?
We were just starting to read that now, so when it was that, I read it a while back, but I remember when reading it, it was a celebration, and I'm thinking it was either Ezra or Nehemiah, because they come back from the exile, they built the wall, they built the temple, and they're
okay. Yeah. Okay. So here's the initial contrast that I want to make. It's kind of an important one theologically. If Ezra and Nehemiah seems to be focusing on Jerusalem and what's going on in Jerusalem, the city. What's going on according to their historical accounts seems to be focusing on failure with the covenant community. Chronicles ends, if we remind ourselves of what happens there at the ending of Chronicles, we've got something different going on there. So you've got these historians. We think of the historian, we call him the chronicler, who's responsible for this ending of his book. Remember, we talked about this before. This is the Cyrus decree, and according to the author of Chronicles, he cuts it in half, right at this Hebrew word, let him go up. Right before he gets to the part the Cyrus decree focuses on this city. Let him go up to Jerusalem. Nope, he cuts that off. So we've talked about a little bit there. There seems to be something going on there with how the author of Chronicles, the historian theologian, is wanting to put some emphasis on something that's future related. And we talked about that with the midterm. We get into that discussion there, focusing on what's ahead, the future, the coming day of the Lord, and some of those things that seem to be in his view. But what's interesting here, Ezra and Nehemiah focus on the failure of what's presently, has just recently happened in Jerusalem. All right, so let's contrast what might be going on here. And what I'm doing is bringing in a little bit more possibility with regards to what might be going on more with the mind and within the purview of the author of Chronicles, the chronicler, the theologian who's responsible for this. So now I want to make a case and talk about what might be kind of under the hood with regards to what the chronicler's agenda, his theological agenda is. All right, so this gets back to, now I'm bringing in another voice, another contributor to the theological history of a group of people who have come back from exile. And do you remember, they would have benefited from his ministry, the prophet Isaiah. So let's talk about the prophet Isaiah. And a couple of huge theological mountain peaks that come out of the theology of the prophet Isaiah. Remember, it's 66 books. And we talked about it, well, if you had me in prophets, we talked about the 3 Isaiahs, or really just, I would argue, 1 Isaiah. But part of the book of Isaiah focuses on 3 different audiences coming from the single prophet. So let's take a look at something that we, if you haven't had me for prophets, I put a little emphasis on. Let's turn to the prophet Isaiah in what's called the middle section of Isaiah in chapter 41 and verses 1 through 4. So let's see here. Could I have Joel, could you read for us chapter 41, 1 through 4 in Isaiah?
Keep silence before me, O islands, and let the people renew their strength. Let them come near, and let them speak. Let us come near together to judgment. Who raised up the righteous man from the east, called him to his foot, gave the nations before him, and made him rule over kings. He gave them dust to the sword, and has driven stubble to his bow. He pursued them, and passed safely, even by the way that he had not gone up with his feet. Who hath wrought and done it, calling the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he.
So in this part of the prophet's message here in chapter 41, we have this reference to one coming from the east. One who comes from the east. And then, in chapter 42, we have this prophet identified. Keep reading there, Joel, in chapter 42, 1 through verses 42, 1 through 4.
42, 1 through 4?
Yes.
Behold my servant, whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighted. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. The bruised reed shall not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. He shall not fail, nor be discouraged, till he has set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law.
Okay, so we have the work of this servant being described here by the prophet Isaiah. He's coming to bring judgment against God's people. So we see that. And finally, in the climax of the servant here being described in chapter 44, beginning in verse 26 in Isaiah, confirming the word of his servant and performing the purpose of his messengers, it is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah they shall be built. And I'll raise up her ruins again. It is I who says, to the depth of the sea be dried up, and I will make your rivers dry. It is I who says of, Cyrus. He is my shepherd. He shall perform all that I desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. So what's interesting there is we have this identification of servant number 1, according to Isaiah, a.k.a. Cyrus. So this mention of Cyrus would have been great news of encouragement to those who were in exile, receiving this message and waiting and asking the question, what is it going to look like when God starts to act again? Well, he's going to raise up a political servant. Remember, we talked about 2 kinds of servants in the prophet Isaiah. One is a political servant, Cyrus, and to those who are in exile, they're waiting for something to happen with this guy's name attached to it. And when that happens, it's going to be God's working through this servant. And that's what we see in the Cyrus decree, which includes these words, let him go up. So now, we're not done yet. So Isaiah's not done talking about the role of the servant. See, we have another servant who's coming on the scene. And it's interesting that the book Ezra builds on the political implications of this servant, because how does he begin his history? Right? The book of Ezra, do you remember the very first thing he includes? Right, the Cyrus decree in its full form. So Ezra starts, and remember we read Ezra and Nehemiah kind of together in terms of a historical corpus, right? But it starts with the Cyrus decree. So Ezra, in terms of being a historian theologian, has great interest in the Cyrus decree as being identified as God's fulfillment, I think, of the promised servant from the prophet Isaiah. Okay, so put a peg in that. Now let's move on to the fact that Isaiah is not done in talking about the ongoing evolution of the role of the servant. Let's turn to Isaiah 52. Isaiah 52. And this is familiar turf for all of us. So this is, chapter 52, starting in verse 13. Behold, my servant will prosper. He'll be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you, my people, Ami, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. He'll sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. And if we move ahead to chapter 53, starting in verse 4, what's his role? What's he going to accomplish? Surely, in verse 4, I'll translate it from the Hebrew. Surely our sickness he himself bore, and our sufferings he carried. I like that translation a little better. But what did we do? Well, we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted by God. Why? It's because he deserved it. And then Isaiah corrects. But no, that's wrong. He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the chastening for our shalom, our well-being, fell upon him. And by his scourging, we were healed. So there's the great reversal there. But now we have the role of the second servant. So let's see. Servant number 2. And this servant is going to be not a named servant, but a suffering, right? A suffering servant. Now here's where it really gets interesting. In my view, I'm going to go back to the historians here. So we have Ezra and Nehemiah working together on their historical theological magnum opus, their work. And we'll talk about next week, we'll finish up with the chronicler in his famous last words, which are the last words of the Hebrew canon, the Bible of the day, for Paul, for Jesus, and everybody in the first century church that read their Bible. They were reading 2 Chronicles chapter 36 last. But I think what's going on here is that the author of Chronicles, he has an opportunity to evaluate the same period of history, this post-exilic period, because he's the last contributing author. He's the one that's writing almost last, scholars would suggest. Ezra and Nehemiah have already written down their history. So what's he going to do? He has everything in his view, including the words of Isaiah the prophet. He probably has access to that. So he's inspired divinely, and his theological mind is at work. He has a chance to evaluate the entire period of history from Zerubbabel to Ezra to Nehemiah and say something about it. What does he do? He says nothing about it. He excludes it all. And it ends, his history, the chronicler ends with just basically what happens just before the post-exilic period begins. And he ends his history with a cut-off version of the Cyrus decree with the Hebrew words, let him go up, with an invitation. See, here's what I think is going on. All right, so you've got Ezra and Nehemiah. Here it is really simple. They're looking at their ending, and they're evaluating, and right on top of the historical period of the post-exilic period, the people who came back to rebuild the walls, to rebuild the temple, and rebuild the covenant community, they end on failure, but they end with, all they can say is what we're writing about is really the political fulfillment of the promised servant, Cyrus. We got back here because God raised up Cyrus and worked through Cyrus to allow us to come back. But here's where I think is different. I think the author of Chronicles he's aware of the servant one role for Cyrus, but he does an interesting twist. He uses the same Cyrus decree to create a different theological emphasis. By cutting it in half at the word "let him go up," what he's doing is focusing on the future ministry of the suffering servant, which in the time of his writing, of course, hasn't happened yet. So there's a future-looking intention of the author, theologian of the books Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, because of how he ends and deliberately uses the Cyrus decree. Cyrus decree, not servant number 1, according to Isaiah, but servant role number 2, which is future. So it's an invitation to anyone reading to say, let them go up. Well, where are they going up to? Take a look at the beginning part of I call it the package of Isaiah 52, 53, and the focus there on the suffering servant. Where's the context? What's the emphasis there given by the prophet? Take a look at chapter 52 in Isaiah, starting in verse 6. Before we get to the emphasis on the suffering of the servant, there's something that sometimes we overlook. There's something else that's applied to this particular servant. Therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day, I am the one who is speaking, here am I. And then he says, how lovely are the mountains, are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, and who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, you watchmen, lift up their voices and shout joyfully together. For they will see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion. So we have this focus on the future day of the Lord and the emphasis on Zion that's coming, Mount Zion. So this future role, this future task of, this let them go up emphasis. Remember, Isaiah's the one who probably got it started all the way back in Isaiah chapter 2. It's that text I oftentimes go back to. This invitation to Zion, so that you can participate in all of these things. Now it will come about in chapter 2, verse 2 in Isaiah. Now it will come about that in the last days, the mountain, that's Zion, of the house of the Lord will it reside, will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. And all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up. There we go. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways and that we may walk in his paths, for the Torah will go forth from Zion. So it's that picture again, right, of the day of the Lord, and when the Lord comes to reign and rule and establish peace and restoration for the nation of Israel, and all of these things start to happen. So I think Isaiah is influencing the chronicler. I think he's kind of recognizing both fulfillments of the promised servant, the prophetic promise coming from Isaiah, and that's another way of understanding his very intentional ending. Hopefully all that makes sense. So we've got this picture here coming, this let us go up to Zion, and I think it's here. I put the cross, I found this picture, is really good, Mount Zion, but at the top, very intentionally, you've got the cross. So it's the anticipation of this coming servant. And of course, the fulfilled role, the ministry of Christ that comes to fulfill the promise of this servant. So that's what we had. And that's what we see here in Isaiah. In other words, the suffering comes and then the exaltation comes. And, the author of Chronicles is recognizing the suffering role, but in the fullness, he's also anticipating the exaltation of this servant as well. So let him go up. That's our invitation. That's got some gospel power behind it, doesn't it? When we share the gospel, we're anticipating and we're introducing people. When we share the gospel, we're inviting them into this promise, something that they have to look forward to anticipate. And when they read the words of the Old Testament and all of these prophetic promises, once they know that and it's got their name written on it, that's when it starts to come alive. Austin, did you have a question, or are you just stretching? Okay, all right. All right, enough on that. Are there any questions that kind of got excited? I always get excited when I think about that. Yeah.
Where in the Chronicles is it that it end, that it go up?
The very last verse. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very last word. It's one Hebrew word that it's a verbal form that means let him go up. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Well, just like I said, I get so excited about this. I just might be motivated somewhere in the next couple weeks to put down a question that might relate to this too, because I just love how books end. And in the Old Testament, I think we've got a lot of very deep theological, intentional endings to these books that connect. You've seen how I like to connect the books in terms of what they're speaking to at various times in salvation history, how they address different audiences, various things going on in the world at the time. All of that makes sense. If you understand those things, any book that you have in the Old Testament, you can drop in and make it sing, because it speaks to the audiences back then as well as, the modern context. That's our job when we teach it or preach it from our pulpits. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question from Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 63.
Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 63. Okay.
Where it talks about Barzillai taking a wife and the name of the wife's family. I'm kind of confused there.
Oh, chapter 7, verse 63.
Yes, sir.
So, and of the priests, the sons of Hovaiah, the sons of Hakaz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was named after them. So what's your question?
My question is, how can a man take the name of his wife's family? Because Ezra made reference to it in Ezra 2:61 to 62 as well.
Yes. Ezra 2:61 refers back to this.
Could it be as a result of the intermarriage influence on them?
Yeah, I need to check on that. I think might have something to do with that. Is there
It looks strange.
It does look strange. Yeah. It does look strange. I'd have to do a little looking up on that, just off the top and off the cuff. It just looks like there's some recording there of some violation that shouldn't be happening. So I think you're on to something. Well, let's go on to get into the book of Esther. There's the deep thought picture. I know you're all just captivated by these pictures or confused. So you all see it there?
Esther.
Esther, yes, Esther. And the cat is a Persian cat. Yes, and a Persian rug. You missed those details, right?
I'm saying a Afghan rug.
Ah, okay. All right, so some...
These pictures from...
Well...
He's made
No. I'm not that creative. There's a ministry called Walk Through the Bible that produced them, and I just like to use them in my teaching and preaching. So,
Produce them, how long ago?
well, how long ago did they make them?
Yeah.
Why?
They seem kind of old.
Are you calling me old?
I'm just calling content's old.
Okay.
Still 4x3 too. So it's not even in widescreen.
Oh, brother.
No HD.
Oh, whatever. Whatever. Yeah. Man, you're a rough crowd today. Okay. Well, let me proceed with my old and outdated lecture on Esther and see if we could get anywhere without falling asleep. So we see Esther. you're probably familiar with a little bit of her story in terms of her role behind the scenes. She's not returning with any of the groups that have come back under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So she's behind the scenes, much like Daniel, who stays behind the scenes. And it's really interesting, over the history of the Jewish people, the book of Esther has had a pretty significant ongoing role, just because it reminds them of who they are. Esther's part of the diaspora, the Jews who are in exile, the Jews who remain in exile. And that's, pretty much been the whole history of the people of God, the Jews that have, they identify with a book like this in the Old Testament. We're also going to be introduced to one of the heroes of the book, as we'll see how the book ends, with a focus on a figure called Mordecai, who rises in power and influence behind the scenes, much like a Joseph in Egypt. We'll see, and much like Daniel before, who also rises to gain one of these positions, serving oftentimes in the court of the king, because of their skills of dream interpretation, or just the fact that they're smart and they're maybe they speak multiple languages. They've got some good skill sets that they get the attention and say, "Come and serve in my, in the court." So Mordecai is in that vein. Now, we said earlier in our little chart that the book of Esther is dropping in between Ezra 6 and chapter 7 with regards to this 57-year period there on that little gap. So that's where we find the context of the book of Esther. And this slide is certainly not outdated. It's been updated, actually. You have to look closely. Yes. Another unique thing about this book is that it's not mentioning God by any of his official Hebrew names, Elohim or capital Lord, Yahweh. Not to be found in the book. So that raises a lot of scholarly interest. And it's interesting, this book, Esther, in some of the versions found in the grouping that we call the Septuagint, or the LXX, those books that were translated from Hebrew into Greek. So in some of the variations that we have for the book of Esther, the book includes some additional deuterocanonical material, which means outside of the canon. But it made its way into some of the Septuagint, in a particular grouping of Septuagint versions. So because of that, what happens later is that this same material finds its way into the Latin Vulgate, and subsequently, because a lot of the Catholic translations come from the Latin Vulgate, the deuterocanonical material finds its way into, the Roman Catholic canon. Now, particularly, what you find is possibly something like this. So this is the extra material. It focuses on what's called Mordecai's dream. In this particular, let's see, where do I have it listed here? Well, anyway, so in Mordecai's dream, you see a reference to the name of God and by the word Elohim 2 times, and I have it indicated there at the bottom. So in the Masoretic text, you won't find this deuterocanonical material. That's why in the majority of our English translations, you don't see any of this context listed, because it's recognized to be outside of the canon, except for that long history from the LXX to the Latin Vulgate. English translations of Roman Catholic Bibles, sometimes you'll see this extra text. So I don't know if you, one of my students pointed that out to me. Thanks, James. Appreciate that. So we'll talk about that later. We emailed back and forth on that, but I thought it was interesting. Now, because it doesn't mention, not only does the book of Esther not mention the name of God, but it also doesn't mention the Torah, the idea of covenant, or in no discussion on angels, or some of the theological themes are not mentioned, mercy and forgiveness necessarily. So what you find is, in some portions of the history of the people of God, or in Jewish history, for example, in the Qumran community, and that's the community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, what doesn't show up at all? That's the book of Esther. It's not found in any of the Qumran texts. So it's not found. So that's why it's interesting in the history of the book of Esther, like some of the other books, like the book of Ecclesiastes, some of these books were on the hinge of being included or not being included in the canon. But in the history of the canon, we go all the way up to the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, was really probably the time when the book of Esther was finally wrestled to the ground with regards to this conversation. It was decided, let's include this book. So in my presentation of the book of Esther, I'll probably focus on some of the major reasons why the book of Esther needed to be included, right, in the canon. All right. So historically, we find some interesting history for you history buffs. The Persian king Xerxes is also the famous Persian king made famous by the movie 300. You probably know that. In fact, Europe, the country or the continent of Europe, would be a much different place today had it not been for those fearless Spartan soldiers, those Greek Spartan soldiers. Xerxes lost the war of his attempt to advance right up there in that upper left-hand part of the slide there, where he lost the war against the Greeks, which basically halted the expansion west. So just beyond that point would have been all destinations leading to Europe. But because of the historical battle that was fought at Thermopylae, here, let's see if you can see it. Thermopylae is right over here. There's a narrow band, or kind of along the coastal region, there's a narrow band along the Aegean Sea, and it looks something like this back then. So what we have is this history that talks about Spartans, about 300 Spartans who were held off, basically, the entire Persian army, or most of it, and halted the advance. And the way they did that was using the military technology of the day. I don't know if you studied any of this in school, but Greek, it was called a phalanx. And you basically have these muscle-bound Spartans with their swords and spears, creating this impenetrable wall, but also being able to slowly, cause the mounds of the dead and dying and injured to rise up with regards to how could you break through something like that. And the advantage they had at Thermopylae was the sea on the left and the higher cliffs on the right. There was no way to get through except for right there. So can you imagine what it would look like to come up against something like this? A wall of shields and spears coming through. And you can imagine, the Persian army, what they had to fend off. Well, let's just see. In a National Geographic archive, I actually have video footage of the actual battle that took place. And let's see what it may have looked like. VHS. Whoa! Sorry about that. All right, that's why Michigan, the state of Michigan, called one of their football teams the Spartans, right? Because they held off the entire Persian army until reinforcements could come. So it's an interesting bit of history. Okay, let's move on. So we talk about the relationship of Xerxes. Let's take a look at the beginning of the book of Esther. And let's have Jessica back here. Could you read for us? In chapter 1, starting in verse 1.
1:1?
Yep, starting until I tell you to stop. Well, just start reading there in verse 1.
Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was in Susa, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces, being in his presence. He displays the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Susa, the capital, from the greatest to least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones.
Okay, so there's this great extravagant banquet that's thrown by the Persian king. And these Persian kings, typically, we know from history, loved attention. They loved to be praised. They had the title. They would call themselves or want to be addressed as King of Kings. Not that they were wanting to be worshipped as a god, but they came pretty close. And so we have Darius here. This is an actual Kodak picture of Persian King Darius the First with his son Xerxes in the upper left, and the lower right there is actually King Xerxes right there. So these different pictures that we have. More history talks of Xerxes from archaeology. We have coinage, stamped impressions of the king Xerxes. So this early context of the book of Esther, here in this particular context, we see that there's going to be conflict that comes between Xerxes and his current queen, Vashti. Verse 9 talks about her banquet that she's having for the women in the palace. So you've got one for men, you've got one for women. And so this is going to precipitate this particular conflict is going to raise political risk for the king. And she refuses him, which would have made him look bad and lose face in front of everybody in the kingdom. So that's what we have in verses 19 through 22. Let's see here. Let's go over to what page? Here we go. Patrick's not here. Let's have Wes. Could you read for us? Chapter 1, verses 19 through 22.
If it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Ahasuerus' presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. The decree the king issues will be heard throughout the vast kingdom, so all women will honor their husbands from the greatest to the least. The king and his counselors approved the proposal, and they followed Memucan's advice. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be master of his own house and speak in the language of his own people.
Yeah, it's an interesting decree. It's in response to Vashti refusing to make her presence known. He wanted to show her off at his banquet. She refuses, so this is what it leads to. He's going to order her to be replaced. And in chapter 2, verses 2, we see the kings attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins, young women be sought for the king," verse 2 and verse 4. Then the young lady who pleases the king would be queen in place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So this is the solution that came about. So that sets the context for what comes next. And in verses 5 through 6, we're introduced to the individual named Mordecai. Let's see here. Grace, could you read for us? Chapter 2, verses 5 and 6.
Now there was a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimon, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem, who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king
Jeconiah,
of Judah, whom
Nebuchadnezzar.
Ezra, the king of Babylon, had exiled.
So this is a time marker that refers us back to the same deportation that involved the second one that involved the prophet Ezekiel. So we see that Mordecai is on that train. That's the one that we read back in 2 Kings 24, verses 16 and verses 14 through 16. We read about that deportation. So that tells us in history when Mordecai made the trek over to then known as Babylon, now known as Persia, and he's going to raise Hadassah. Was she named here? No. Yeah, we need to read a little further here. So verse 7 says, "And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter." Now this is interesting, and one of my students brought this to my attention, and I thought, hey, this is something I'll bring to class. What's interesting, well, first of all, Hadassah is the name in Hebrew that means myrtle. So we see her called by her Hebrew name, and her probably her Persian name, well, it is her Persian name. Esther is probably the word in Persia that refers to star. So she's got two names, one her Hebrew name, Hadassah, but also her name in Persian that means star, and that's Esther. But she's lost both parents, and Mordecai, I don't know if you're in verse 7, some of the controversy gets into whether or not Mordecai's role was uncle or an older cousin. What's your translation say? So my translation says his uncle, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Well, okay. So here's where we get into the situation. So this gets into a little bit of a background of the text leading up to some of the English translations. Or in our textbook on page 248, Bill Arnold talks about the book tells the story of a beautiful woman and her uncle, that is Mordecai, right, who risked their lives to save the Jews from destruction. Now, what we have going on here, you might run into this idea. See, I think that, and I'm going to argue for Mordecai's being an older cousin. That lines up well with the Masoretic text, and most of our English translations go that direction. But occasionally you'll run into something like this, and surprisingly in our own textbook. So that's why I wanted to bring it to your all's attention. You'll read then our textbook that Mordecai's an uncle, but you have the right to think of him as an older cousin. Not to break a church up over this. This is not one of those issues, but it's interesting. It's interesting nonetheless. What we have again is some early Latin translations of the Hebrew text include the idea of the brother idea that you see in this translation up here instead of uncle. So what we have, that means that Mordecai becomes the uncle of Esther, and people who go that way think of an uncle as being older, So the role of taking Esther on as a daughter makes a little more sense. So there's some arguments that go that direction. And but sometimes the Latin translators say, remember, they're translating into Latin from Hebrew. They might have gotten it wrong. Or they might be trying to fix a situation that they saw in their Hebrew manuscript. So this uncle idea, in this particular reference, this translation at the top comes from a Catholic translation called the Reims Catholic Bible. So there's where it's showing up in some English translations. But the Catholic translations oftentimes are relying upon those Latin translations that came before. But the majority of translations that we find out there go with what the Masoretic text does, and it maintains the idea of Mordecai being an older cousin. So it's interesting. And I think that that's probably correct. Mordecai is an older cousin, and much like a Boaz from the book of Ruth, he's going to step into this situation, Mordecai, and act on what he understands to be proper covenant behavior. And just like, when Esther loses her mom and dad, he's going to take her into his household, right, and to provide for this, in this case, orphan. He's providing for an orphan here. And in the text, verse 7, in the second part of verse 7, we see the context of their relationship amplified a bit. Mordecai takes her as his own daughter. So that's, I think, the author here is giving us emphasis on Mordecai's intention to provide for her and to take her in as an older cousin. So I don't know if we need to say anything more about that. If you go with something else, I think that, scholars who do this, and there's others who do this, they're basically amending the text. So they're looking at the Latin saying, well, the Latin may have gotten it right. So this idea of Mordecai being an uncle instead of a cousin, it's not in the Masoretic text, so we're going to what would be called amend the text. And I think that's what Bill Arnold probably is doing here with in his reference to Mordecai being an uncle. All right, just be aware that you might run into that. So here we have Esther. And like Mordecai, now Esther is going to find favor in the court of the king. Let's see here. Derek, in the back, could you read verses 8 and 9 in chapter 2? Are you still here? Yep, there you are.
8 and 9?
Yep.
When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into the best place in Tyre.
Okay, so we see how she finds favor in the eyes of the king, and then we have the kind of a Mordecai stepping in as the older cousin, and Esther did not make known her people or her kindred or her relatives, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. So we've got some crisis that's starting to brew here. King Xerxes was probably interested in more than just her beauty, and we see that it was Esther's turn to spend the night with the king and to please the king in this way, and we see that in verses 15 through 17. So now in the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king. She did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So this was another reason why the book of Esther was called into question at various times in the history of the Jews. and had a questionable role in the canon. The question probably that was asked is, what do we do with the Jewish girls having this kind of behavior? How can we allow this to find its way into the Bible, I mean, this is inappropriate behavior, really, right? I mean, what's wrong with this picture? We've got Mordecai encouraging Esther to lie and remain deceitful about who she really is. And unlike Daniel and his friends, who refused to eat the king's choice food, here in verse 9, we have her not refusing, right? Anything that's coming from the king. And Esther chooses to follow through with this 6-day period of beautification, which was a pagan practice. Esther could have relied on her natural beauty, right? Esther commits adultery. She does not become his queen until after they have their night together. And then Esther agrees to intermarriage. Wasn't this the whole problem in Nehemiah and Ezra? Married to a pagan. Wasn't this a huge problem back in those books? I mean, how can we possibly include this book? Can I understand? This was controversial in a different way, kind of like the book Song of Solomon. Right? We had that controversy there. So how do we respond to this? I kind of built it up kind of in a serious tone there. I mean, sure, we can respond. The thing that we have to understand is, and the reason why this book is making its way into the canon and recognized as being canonical, is it's telling the reality or the real situation of those who are in exile and those who are in these particular positions. We cannot put Mordecai and Hadassah or Esther in the same context as those who have gone back to Jerusalem to express covenant relationship in every jot and tittle of society. We've got kind of a unique situation going on here with Esther and Mordecai. They've both risen to positions of influence, but they're behind enemy lines, aren't they? Right? They're part of an underground church in a not very favorable government situation. So we have to be fair to their situation. And we're going to see elements where they're listening to the Lord. I think it's kind of, even though the word God is not mentioned, we're going to see indirect references to what's going on spiritually behind the scenes. And all along the way, I'll show you, I think, if I'm right, that Esther and Mordecai are trusting in the Lord, as well as leaning on and depending on the covenant community that's around. They've got to make some tough choices. Otherwise, their heads may get cut off, and then they become totally unusable for the Lord. So there's some of that going on. So in chapter 2, what we have here with Mordecai, let's take a look at chapter 2 and move over to verse 21 and down through verse 23. Let's see. Anything here? Nope. Okay. Michael's not here. John, where are you? I know you're here. Over here. Could you read for us in chapter 2, verse 21 through 23?
In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and
Teresh?
two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door became angry and sought to lay hands on King Cyrus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence.
Okay, so this would have been huge news of the day. If you're thinking of world dictators, I have this picture of Hitler. He had 6 failed assassination attempts on his life during his reign. But this picture tells the story. Who are the faithful Christians, behind the scenes here at work. And at a particular time in world history when a particular people group had extreme hatred towards the Jews politically, it's interesting parallel to this particular time in history for the context for the book of Esther. if we move over to chapter 3. So Mordecai's going to, because of situations like that where he's showing faithfulness to this Persian king with regards to a failed assassination attempt, right around the corner, here we have this huge conflict brewing. And we've got opposition coming, namely in the person of Haman. So in chapter 3, verse 1, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. So you might just read right over that, but let me give you a little quick history lesson with regards to why Haman would have this extreme hatred towards the Jews. Do you know what the reason is? Does anybody? Well, he's an Agagite. Yeah. Does that mean anything? Well, let's go back to remind ourselves of this history. Let's go all the way back to Exodus chapter 17. And we'll build a little historical case as to why an Agagite in the time of Esther would have an extreme hatred towards Jews. Chapter 17, verses 8 and 9. So it starts with the Amalekites. And we spent a little time talking about the Amalekites earlier this semester. And the Amalekites have various times in history when they show up with extreme opposition to God's agenda for that time. So then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. Moses says to Joshua, "Choose men for us, go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Skip down to verse 14. So because of this conflict, we've got this long-standing judgment that'll be extended into history future, and it's in verse 14. So Yahweh, the Lord, says to Moses, "Write this down as a memorial so you can remember, and recite it to Joshua, the next generation, that I will blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." So this is going to extend into future situations. Let's turn all the way over, remind ourselves of that famous chapter, what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let's turn there, 1 Samuel chapter 15. We spent a lot of time earlier in this semester talking about this conflict here between Saul and, here he is, and Saul captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So there's that judgment that's extended through Saul, although it was incomplete. That's what got Saul in trouble. But here's the reference to the connection of the king, Agag, and the idea of the Agagites coming from this particular time in history. So if Haman's an Agagite, he's coming from the, scholars argue, the line of the Amalekites. So he's now moved way into the future, and he's showing up again as an individual, but with fond memories of this historical grudge against the Jews and their God, right? I don't know. That's the best I can explain it. So he's got an old score to settle with any Jews that show up, as any Amalekites showing up in history would have the same propensity to bring about this opposition. So what happens here in this context is Mordecai is going to refuse to bow and pay homage to Haman, and this is going to this conflict will escalate, but between those two individuals, Mordecai and Haman. So much so that we see in chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, this is going to overlap and eventually intersect with potential conflict that will implicate all of the Jews who are back in Jerusalem. So let's have Jacob. Yeah. Could you read chapter 3, beginning in verse 2?
And
down through verse 6.
All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had been told that he was a Jew.
Keep going.
When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Yeah, there you go. So he's going after the whole group, if he can make it happen politically. And that's just about what happens here in the book. In chapter 3, verse 8. Keep reading there, Jacob. In chapter 3, verse 8 through 11.
Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews.
Yep.
"Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please."
Okay. So this is ramping up here as a politically motivated assassination of an entire nation. So what's interesting here, we have references, and here are some of the subtle clues that we have, references to, indirect references to God, right? He's not mentioned by name, Elohim or Yahweh, but notice in verse 8, your translation said something different. Mine says, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws. What's yours say?
Their customs.
Customs, yeah. So their laws are different from those of all the other people. And they don't observe the king's laws. What are these laws? What's this a reference to? Right? It's the Torah. It's what Ezra is preaching from his pulpit back in Jerusalem. It's the teachings and instructions of Moses that are hopefully becoming the foundation for this new community in and around Jerusalem. So they're there having church and word's getting out. This people's different. They don't do everything that the king of Persia would want them to do. Kind of like this Mordecai guy. He's just a personification of all of them back home, and this has become a problem. So Haman here is playing his political card. And it's obvious that Haman is a very wealthy enemy of the Jews. He's well funded. This reference to a talent. It's equal to 75 pounds of silver. You can imagine. So he's kind of pretty wealthy. In those days, 1 talent of silver was the equivalent of how much it would pay a boat's rowing crew for 1 month. That's just 1 talent. So that's 75 pounds of silver. So these laws in verse 8, I think that they're the Torah. So again, indirect reference to the Lord, I think, there. And all right, so this is an edict. We have it in chapter 3, down in verse 13. So letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. This is harsh language, right? This is World War II all over again. And both young and old, women and children in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is a month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples so that they should be ready for this day. So this is worse than crisis situation. Xerxes and Haman are going to sit down and share a little bit of, some bubbly and celebrate this moment while the whole city is going to rise in confusion. So we'll move ahead now. So now we are in chapter 4, and again, why I think this book was moved its way into the canon, and it's very close to the kernel of what's going on with regards to 2 individuals whose the whole future of everything that's going on back in Jerusalem is on swinging on a hinge. So it's going to end up being a book that illustrates the behind-the-scenes faith and trust in the Lord. I think that's what the book's, part of the book's function is theologically. So chapter 4 is going to get us to what I think is in terms of text, the theological high point of the entire book. And it's just like Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah, when he first heard that there's problems going on back home, he was one who trusted in the Lord. Remember, he prayed, and the door opened up for the Persian king to allow him to go back, and gave him supplies, actually, and authority to go back and start rebuilding the walls of the city. In that same kind of vein, now we've got Mordecai, and we have him responding in a similar way. Let's look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. And Christina, did I have you read? Okay, sorry, you were trying to hide back there. I'm sorry.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Read a little bit for us in chapter 4, beginning in verse 1.
When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them.
Okay, so what would be accompanying this kind of extreme grieving? What typically went hand in hand with this kind of mourning and this kind of grieving, right? I mean, it's not mentioned in the text, but I think we could fill in that, with the grieving comes, like Nehemiah, it leads to prayer. Well, but it's not listed. We don't have a mini prayer like we did in the early part of the book of Nehemiah listed here for Mordecai, but we can assume that he's trusting in the Lord as he's grieving and moving through the emotional reality to the situation where an entire group of Jews are going to be exterminated. So this is his crisis. Now, Mordecai is going to reply to Esther through a messenger. And chapter 4, over in verses 10 through 11, 10 through 12. So chapter 4, verse 10 through 12. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. Quote, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that person that he must be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I had not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And they related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, quote, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all of the other Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. There's theology underneath that ice, right? We see, the situation that's raised up, and the implication is, Esther now is in a situation. If she does nothing, she is as good as dead with all of the other Jews. But if she does something that is entering the court of the king unsummoned, she could risk death as well. So Esther's all of a sudden now if I do go this direction or if I go this direction, it's probably going to lead to my death. So what we have going on here is, the anticipation of some divine intervention. Again, I think in this context, it's clear that the author has every intent to help us, get us to a place of filling in the blank to say, look at what God is doing behind the scenes. Even though his name is not mentioned, Mordecai replies here in verse 14, if Esther does nothing, his implication is, if she does nothing, help is going to come from some other source. And that's an indirect reference to the fact that God is sovereign. God's going to step in on behalf of his people, with or without Esther. But he's encouraging Esther, to do the right thing. And I think that's an indirect reference to the Lord. And then the reference here, the famous words, for such a time as this, I think suggests that, this is a sovereign moment for Esther. It's an open door, Esther. Step in. God will have your back, and as a result, he has the back of his people in mind here, despite this extreme, chaotic, very sinister situation that we find ourselves in. So I think there's theology kind of leaping off the page here. And again, it's the example of a faith community at work, but behind enemy lines, right, in exile. Let's see. And it's interesting, if we just think of Esther as an individual, what kind of person is it that steps into a situation like this, I mean, she's in a situation where she's got to take the steps forward. Kind of like I think back of our conversation with regards to King David on the battlefield, running out to encounter the Philistine giant. Who prepared him for such a time as this, right? Somebody back home praying for and helping. Somebody helped her to understand, how do you trust in the Lord in a situation like this? She's got, I think I'm just filling in the blanks here, but I think somebody had to prepare Esther a little bit to understand, how does God work? How do I trust in the Lord? And this is what we see going on here, I think, in the context for this situation. Esther and Mordecai both would have come out of a faithful covenant community, so that they would have an understanding, so that they could process the situation, which leads them down this path. So let's pick up next week with this slide. And we'll finish Chronicles next week as well. All right, thanks for your attention today. Almost tonight.
All right, good enough.